Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Nuggets News. Today we've got a special guest and that's John Basilios from Hall and Wilcox Lawyers. How are you, John?
Very well. How are you?
Pretty well. A few of you might recognize John from our security tokens event the other night, and I wanted to have him on and talk pretty casually, but just go over these questions that we're constantly getting. People want to know if they can play in this space and how the regulations are going to work. So you're pretty familiar and comfortable with all this now, John.
Yeah, and thanks for having me.
No worries. I guess the first question people want to know is what's the difference between a security token and a utility token and a currency?
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe starting with the easiest, which is a currency. So currency is generally used for the payment for goods and services, and it's not necessarily associated with only being able to be used on a particular platform. A utility token is generally a token which is used to access someone's platform for a specific purpose, whether it's some sort of a health records or health data platform or any other platform that you might have out there which is specific to that utility token. A security token is generally an interest in a company, no different really to shares in a company, other than the fact that the shares in that company are tokenized and are on the blockchain.
Yeah. Now, I think where the confusion lies for a lot of people is they're hearing this term managed investment scheme get thrown around, but not all security token offerings do actually fall into that category. So, do you want to talk about the differences there?
Yeah, sure. So a managed investment scheme is basically almost anything else that is kind of like an investment where people pool their money that is not a share in a body under Australian law. So it's really kind of the type of structure that would be used, for example, for a managed fund where people pool their money and that money is invested on a collective basis on behalf of the investors. It's much easier for what we understand to be an ICO to fall within the definition of a managed investment scheme than it is to fall within a definition of a security in Australia, because we have these two concepts of security and managed investment scheme. Whereas in the US, they've got the definition of security, which captures what we would call a managed investment scheme.
Yeah. Now, this, I guess it affects everyone in the space, even someone like myself who might not be able to talk about specific projects. So, how does that legal framework come into it in terms of who needs an AFSL to have a project or to talk or market a project or so on?
Yeah, sure. So I guess just going to the ICO itself, if an ICO is a managed investment scheme, that means that the issuer or the promoter needs to hold an Australian financial services license, which authorises them to be able to operate that scheme. They would need to register the scheme with ASIC. They would need to lodge a constitution that complies with various requirements in the Corporations Act, and they would also need to lodge a compliance plan with ASIC that again meets a number of requirements set out in the Corporations Act. And in order to offer interests in that managed investment scheme, they would also need to prepare what's called a product disclosure statement, which is similar to the concept of a prospectus, but it's quite specific to financial products that are not shares in a body, as set out under the Corporations Act. And then the other thing to bear in mind is that anyone who markets that managed investment scheme also needs to have an Australian financial services license, which authorises them especially to market managed investment schemes. The other thing to be wary of is that whether it's a managed investment scheme or a security token, you can't be listed on an ordinary crypto exchange. It needs to be on a licensed market operator exchange, similar to that of the ASX, or if the market operator wanted to be the counterparty to the trades, i.e. the buys and the sells, they could operate it under an Australian financial services license that actually authorises them to make a market in those securities or managed investment schemes.
Yeah, I think you've touched on a lot of points there that I want to dive into. So, as you say, a lot of projects now have their raising, and there's just nowhere for these things to trade. And now we're in the situation where exchanges are even hesitant on things that might be a security. So, it's a double edged sword. So, we're going to see security token exchanges come online Now, I think I've heard that there's a few that are applied in Australia and whatnot, but what about if I'm an Australian investor and there's an exchange in Malta or Cayman Islands? Am I allowed to participate in this ecosystem, whether it be in the initial raising or the trading of these tokens?
Look, I think the general answer to that is yes, subject to the laws of that particular jurisdiction not having any restrictions on people coming into that space. Now, my understanding from the Malta perspective is that it's intended to be able to be a hub for the rest of the world to invest in security tokens that are offered through Malta.
Cool. So I guess all this has come about, just to take a step back, John, because of what happened. So in 2016, you could send in some Ethereum and you'd get your tokens. And then in 2017, it just went nuts. And now we're seeing scams and all this sort of thing. So I said the other night that this is the natural maturation of the space, that investors are demanding more. There's going to be that regulation. Do you hope we find this happy medium for the raising of money and for better quality projects and for the trading of all these tokens?
Look, I think that unless specific utility token laws are passed, such as in other jurisdictions like Malta, Gibraltar, and the others, we're going to be stuck with the security token regime or securities regime because of the heavy regulation and licensing and burden associated with operating and managed investment schemes. It just doesn't make it, I think, feasible. Whereas a security token offering, it's a lot easier to comply with because all you really need is a disclosure document that complies with the requirements of the Corporations Act, and there's no kind of licensing associated with that. Ideally, it would be great if Australia could pass laws that allow for utility tokens and excludes them from being managed investment schemes or securities, where there's a genuine utility token aspect to it and where there isn't a promise of any sort of returns to investors. I think that would be the ideal situation, but the law takes a long time to catch up, and you've got to convince the politicians to pass these laws, and there's no real, I guess, impetus for that at the moment. But I think it will come in time, or I hope it will.
Yeah, I'll definitely come back and talk about that a little bit more at the end, but I just want to talk about a few of these sort of exceptions that people might be hearing. So there's a few instances where you actually don't have to do AML and KYC for the raising of some security tokens. Is that right in my understanding?
Yeah, so if it's actually just an issue of shares in that company, like any other company, you don't actually need to do KYC on your clients under Australian law, but you do need to identify who your investors are because you need to keep a register of investors, so you need their name and address. Yep. But it's not the full AML, CTF, KYC process associated, for example, with doing a managed investment scheme. Whereas if you had a managed investment scheme, you're doing it under an AFSL, and as such, you would need to do KYC on all of your investors.
Yeah, and there's some different rules around the number of investors. If there's under 20, you can do something differently compared to having unlimited sophisticated investors. Is that a bit of a rule?
Yeah, so there's an exception. This exception there's a similar exception that applies both under the managed investment scheme regime and under the securities regime. So basically what that says is if you limit your offer to sophisticated and wholesale investors, and there's no limit on the number of sophisticated and wholesale investors, but you make personal offers to people that you know or have an interest potentially investing in your project, and they're not sophisticated and professional, so what we'd call retail investors, you can offer that you can receive investments from up to 20 of the retail investors in any 12-month period, provided you don't raise more than $2 million from them. There's a similar exception in the managed investment scheme space from the requirement to actually register the scheme, but you would still need a license, even though you don't need to register the scheme if you relied on that exception.
Okay, cool. I think a lot of people have this idea that it's going to go to security tokens as equity in a lot of these projects, and they're going to get bypassed as people go, back to the richer guys and just raise that money easily. But I guess I want the people at home to recognise that this capital formation process isn't just raising money for projects. So we can tokenize assets, whether that's commodities or real estate, and fractionalize ownership of all of these. And this can all fall under that security token realm. And in that instance, the people running these will want wide ownership. They'll want the average guy to be able to buy $100 of a project or a mine or something if they want. Do you agree with all that?
Yeah, for sure, definitely. Anything that you can potentially do through a company now, there's no reason why that company can't just tokenize the shares in that company. So you can think of any company that's kind of operating at the moment. In the future, I see that most of them will tokenize their shares and have them on the blockchain.
That's fantastic to hear for people that sort of. I know some people are still thinking that this is all a bubble and crypto is nothing and blockchain is not useful. I just get so bullish when we have these conversations and see professional people really entering this space now. Is that something you're seeing, John? People sort of come to terms with what is blockchain and how this is going to shape the future a little bit.
Yeah, for sure, and that you kind of leads into a really important point that I think ICOs have probably gained a pretty bad reputation from the people who have done the wrong thing. And by bringing it into a regulated space, whether it's a security token offering or a managed investment scheme, does two things. One, it brings legitimacy to the industry, and two, brings in a regulatory framework that puts in place consumer protection mechanisms.
Yeah.
Now, there are some issues with the philosophy behind blockchain not necessarily being there in that environment, in that, it's not totally decentralized, and you've got kind of centralized, closed, closed network blockchain. But I still think that it's better to have those protections in place than not.
I think there's definitely still ways, as we've spoken about, for a company that wants to be widely owned to do that, and that the way of raising capital wasn't possible really that way before, and in small amounts and more liquid. There's so many benefits we get. I guess that's the thing I wanted to wrap up on, was go back to your point before about, we talk to these startup companies in Australia and they tell us it's so hard to get funded. There's not a lot of VCs. They're not risk taking. There's not that appetite in Australia. So what this whole space and next wave of innovation of security tokens is going to allow is just never seen before capital formation. I think that's so important, and I'd really hate for Australia to push back too far, as you say, maybe not pass the right laws or be overtaxed, and we're going to fall behind as a nation that needs some technology and some innovation because of whatever reasons, housing and commodities slowing down. I won't go into all that, but do you really hope that Australia does become part of this next boom?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that it will really take off once we see few people out there with operating security token exchanges. So I know that there's probably close to half a dozen people applying for those licenses. And once they're in the market, I think there'll be no holding this back. There'll be a lot of people doing security token offerings because they might not otherwise meet the requirements of an ordinary share exchange such as the ASX, but once these people set up their own security token exchanges, you've just got that liquidity there that most smaller investors would want, and it's just going to take off.
I think that's a great place to finish, John. I'll put all your contact details in the description below for people, but thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Cool.